In order to let the doves of urban glory fly free, Lincoln-Sudbury negates and contention one is demolition. Market rate housing threatens existing affordable housing units. Carol Becker of the Star Tribune explains in 2017 that because it is the most cost-effective method, the most common way in which development of new market rate homes occurs is through tearing down older and affordable homes. This problem is nationwide, as the National Apartment Association reports in 2017 that America's densest cities are running out of room for new construction, creating a tight squeeze for space allocation. Thus, the prospect of demolition with more construction is not a possibility, but a certainty. Because of this effect, Austin of the New York Times reports in February of 2018 that in recent years, 250,000 public housing units have been destroyed to convert the land into space for free market housing. The overall effect is quantified by Thrush of the New York Times, who reports in July of 2018 that between 2001 and 2013, the amount of public housing units declined by 10% as market rate housing increased. The impact of more demolition is increased poverty. Forced displacement via the demolition of affordable homes has catastrophic effects for its victims in the long term. Badger of the Washington Post in 2014 posits that converting low-income housing to luxury housing in Chicago has more than doubled the cost of rent, displacing the lower class. Desmond of the Institute for Research on Poverty finds in 2015 that renters that are forced out due to demolition are 25% more likely to be unable to find a house in the long term and 20% more likely to experience sustained unemployment. Contention 2 is rent burdens. An increased prevalence of market rate housing also increases the cost of living in a given area. Shu of Shelterforce explains in November of 2018 that market rate housing is overwhelmingly geared toward luxury market for wealthy buyers. Specifically, Casisto of the Wall Street Journal reports in May of 2015 that 82% of market rate housing consists of things like luxury high-rises and other homes for the wealthy, as they have the potential for the most profits. Problematically, such development prices out people who are only able to afford subsidized housing. Chong of the Journal of Poverty Law and Policy explains in September of 2017 that as communities attract major luxury developments, the demand for and the cost of housing increases, pricing out lower income residents. Bloomgard of the Pacific Standard in 2015 quantifies that promoting market rate housing and removing current rent control protections would increase rents by 50%, ending the trend of mixed income and diverse neighborhoods. The impact of less affordable housing is increasing the cost of living. As rent goes up, lower income residents have less and less money to spend on other necessities. Bristol of the Marketplace explains in 2018 that about 17 million Americans are rent burdened or spending more than 30% of their total income on housing alone. These residents have become more susceptible to displacement, and this occurs as residents can no longer afford to remain in their homes due to rising housing bills with things like high rents or property taxes, which happens when more luxury buildings are built. When placed in such a situation, homelessness is almost inevitable. As Lloyd of the Housing Wire finds in December of 2018, that when rent burdening increases by 2 percentage points, the amount of homeless people increased by 1,500 people. Even if they're not displaced, however, Warren of Johns Hopkins in 2018 continues that rent burdening increases the probability of experiencing material hardships, such as an inability to afford food or medicine, by 44%. Low-income housing is critical to protecting the impoverished, as housing is a prerequisite to any sustainable life. Thus, the CBP estimates that rent assistance and low-income housing has lifted more than 4 million people out of poverty in America. And Manual of the ECP in 2014 quantifies that families have doubled the amount of discretionary income due to lower cost, allowing them to spend 5 times as much money on medical care and 3 times as much for food compared to their market rate counterparts. For these reasons, I'm going to give.
Can I see 2 pieces of evidence? Becker from demolition and increasing rents by 50% from rent burdens.
Everybody good? Lead South affirms resolved, the United States should promote the development of market rate housing in urban neighborhoods. For context, market rate housing is an apartment that has no rent restriction. A landlord who owns market rate housing is free to attempt to rent the space at whatever price they so choose. Our sole contention concerns solving the current housing crisis. In the status quo, America's poorest are experiencing a housing crisis of epic proportions. Indeed, Dr. Andrew Aronod of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition finds in 2017 that we lack 7.4 million affordable and available rental homes. Thus, according to Giselle Routhier of Brandeis University in 2019, more than half of American urban renters are deemed housing insecure, living in ways that are unhealthy or unsustainable. Problematically, affordable housing has worsened this crisis by decreasing the supply of available homes for low-income tenants in 6 ways. The first is by developing fewer homes. Douglas North, a Nobel laureate, explains in 2008 that because developers believe that new rental units will not be as lucrative, they build fewer. Consequently, he finds that rent controls in cities like New York City have led to a shortage of 200,000 rental units that would have been built otherwise. Second, because maintaining apartments becomes unprofitable. Right now, being a landlord is not as profitable as many would assume. Alberts of Curvet shows in 2014 that in New York City, for example, the landlords have an average profit margin of only 3%. North continues that with rent controls, it becomes unprofitable for owners to continue maintaining their properties and paying taxes, eventually letting them fall into disrepair. Third, because the wealthy have nowhere to go. Strauss of the Renters Federation finds in 2018 that building more luxury apartments allows the wealthy to move into those, freeing up the apartments they used to live in and creating a ripple effect that benefits everyone. Thus, she finds that luxury housing reduces forced displacement for people in every income bracket. Problematically, Rebecca Diamond of Stanford University finds in 2019 that when new luxury housing isn't created under rent control regimes, the wealthy move into rental properties that would have otherwise been affordable housing, raising the average income of residents in these properties by 18%. Fourth, by decreasing housing density. Val Awareness of the National Associate of Realtors explains in 2016 that less dense residencies like single-family homes are often exempt from rent controls. According to Casisto of the Wall Street Journal in 2018, this causes investors to reduce construction of multifamily homes and to begin to dump existing multifamily properties. That's bad because Cuff of UCLA writes in 2015 that low-density housing prevents enough housing from being created to keep up with rising housing demand. Fifth, by building different types of buildings. Otto of MIT explains in 2014 that developers avoid building rental properties in an attempt to avoid rent controls, which is why rent controls lead to a 6 percentage point decrease in the fraction of residential properties being available as rental properties. Sixth, by preventing the impoverished from moving in. Miller of the University of Chicago finds in 2008 that in response to potentially making less rent each month, landlords try to find tenants with the highest probability of being able to pay. He concludes that with rent controls, cities become younger, whiter, and richer because the people who need affordable housing the most become far less able to access it. That's why overall, Diamond finds that rent controls reduce the supply of affordable houses by 15%. That in turn leads to higher rates. Franklin Chan of Stanford University writes in 2018 that rents have empirically increased by 5% on average in response to the housing shortages caused by rent controls. And historically, Malik of Market Urbanism finds in 2016 that there was more residential development during the Great Depression than during 1997 because of strict rent control. To protect people's homes, Jan and I are proud of them. I'm Dr. Cross, and over here. Everybody else set?
Yeah.
You can go for it.
So, in your entire case, you say that like affordable housing is bad and that this market rate control is good.
Yeah.
So at that point, are you agreeing to our case in which we tell you that there's a direct trade-off between the two?
We wouldn't tell you there's a direct trade-off. We'd say that like affordable housing fundamentally is a less effective method than like market rate housing.
Okay, so you're talking about the how you compare the two. But I'm saying that like our case, our argument is that pretty simple, that there's like a zero-sum game. There's a direct trade-off.
Like it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. Like,
well then,
probably,
well then.
What we tell you is you're just building more market rate housing than affordable housing.
But you tell me that the reason why there is a housing crisis is because affordable housing is ruining everything.
Right. But
so unless
it's
you can
not
prove
like
that
a
there's a
direct
trade-off.
one-to-one trade-off. We'd argue that like it's like a majority, like it's probably a majority trade-off, but it's not exactly one-to-one. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so on your first contention about demolition, so like the landlord just evict people from their apartments without any sort of like repercussion for that?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, a
so,
lot
like,
of times affordable housing isn't ruled by, or it isn't like
that's not
owned
true though,
by
right? Because there's like
landlords.
federal regulations that mandate that like when it's like a rent controlled apartment, because it's people that are probably underrepresented, they rule that like if you are to demolish it or sell the
No.
deed to a demolitionist, then you you necessarily need to either
Okay,
one
if
give them
that
money or
was
two
true-
like give them areas to move
If
into.
that was true, then the evidence which says that like thousands of people have been displaced because of this demolition.
They might have been
wouldn't-
displaced, but they can just what we
Displaced
tell you
means
is
they
they
don't have a
offer.
home.
That's not true. Displaced means they have to
Yeah.
move out, right? And what we tell you is
Okay,
even
so
though,
where
like,
are they moving to?
Like we tell you is that when you have demolition projects like that, they can't just like kick people out without any approval.
So where do they put
one,
them?
but if I can finish that, or one, give them substantial amounts of money so they can find like a different apartment, or two, relocate them to different
Right.
apartments in different areas. You can
I
ask
don't think
questions
that's
if you
true.
want.
Sure. So, or your first two links are about like it's more profitable for landlords to build houses, right?
First one is just about like yeah.
Okay, so then let's talk about your third link where you say that like it's like a trickle down effect where like the rich people leave and other people take their spot or chain like that. So how long does that whole process take?
Probably not that long, right? Because as soon as you build a luxury apartment, someone in the top income bracket goes to that, and then someone in the income bracket below them moves up. And
Yeah,
then
but
the
it's
below
not just
them
like
moves up,
one
moves up,
person
moves up.
moving into one apartment. It's like a mass exodus of the middle class.
You also
into
don't
the-
just build one luxury apartment at a time. You build like
Yeah,
a
exactly.
couple
So
hundred
my
thousand. So if
question
you
is
build them all
how
at
long
once,
does this take?
How long does it build take an apartment? Like take a
No,
build
that's
an
not
apartment?
what I'm saying.
I mean, that's basically what it is, right?
No,
Just
but
think
you're
about
saying
it. Well,
okay.
then think about it. If you make a
I'm
luxury
thinking about
apartment,
it.
right? Well, okay, so if you make a luxury apartment, right? Then you have people in the top income bracket move up to that.
Yeah, no,
Then
I
the
understand
people
your
in the income
argument.
bracket
That's
below
not the
that.
problem I'm having.
Right.
The problem I'm
like,
having.
it probably doesn't take that long to build an apartment.
The
right?
problem I'm having is not that the
Couple
time it
years,
takes to
maybe.
build the apartment, it's the time it takes for a mass exodus of the middle class into where the upper class used to live. That's why the example, like the
right.
most probable or like the most like actual example of this is like when in the 1950s and what used to be considered like luxury homes is now what the middle classes are living in with like white picket fences, and that didn't happen for like until 60 years after.
I mean, it's not necessarily that, right? It's
Yeah,
like
it is.
like general increase throughout time. Like general
Can you give me an example?
Let me highlight it, but it's this paragraph right here, the little one.
Okay, everyone ready? So, their only contention talks about the housing crisis. The first thing they say is that, well, we need 7 million affordable homes. Nowhere in their case do they tell you that they create affordable homes. They just say that we increase the general supply of homes. That's key because we tell you in our case, when you have market rate housing, it increases the rent and the price that these people have to pay, which means that on net, even if more homes are created, even if you buy their entire case, people cannot afford those homes. Millions of people still suffer. That's a reason to negate, even if you buy their case. Let's go to their first two warrants where they essentially talk about increasing profitability, whether through maintenance or building buildings in the first place. So there's three issues here. One, according to our first contention, in cities where you look at Boston, New York City, where people want to build, they need to tear down existing affordable housing. And this makes sense, right? Because people don't just want to build in a random area, they want to build right in the middle of the city, but unfortunately those places are already bought up by places that have affordable housing. This is why in Chicago, 200,000 units of affordable housing went away as a result of changing to market rate housing, which means that overall, they do not on net increase the supply. They just shift the supply to houses that initially went to poor individuals to those that go to rich individuals. That is a net harm. Second, according to the Washington Post, 73% of building companies report worker shortages. So even if they want to somehow solve all of the supply and create them in new locations, it would take a long time and it probably would not happen. But third, and most importantly, and this is going to bring us into their third warrant. According to the New York Times in 2018, When you saw market rate housing in places like Portland, 95% went to luxury homes for rich individuals. Now this is really important, right? Because it means that they are not increasing the supply directly to the poor, they're increasing it to the rich. And this means that their entire case is reliant on the third warrant, on this idea that the wealthy will somehow go to the new house and then a poor person will take their house. This doesn't make a lot of sense. As Danny explains when we get to their third warrant in Crossfire, and what Chu 15 explains, is that this takes decades to trickle down. What we saw in the 1950s with the baby boomer generation, the only time that poor people have started to move into those houses is coming around now, which is 50 years. We say that we do not have time to wait, because every single day you wait are millions of people being displaced, millions of people who have to face more material hardships. So even if you buy their case, it takes too long, you still vote neg. Then, second, according to Redmond in 2015, what happens when wealthy people move into cities is they create more long-term demand for the housing. So it means that it's not just that they solve the problem of supply, they also create more long-term demand because more wealthy people want more exodus into the region, they want more investment. That only makes the housing crisis worse, only increases rents worse, only links into our case worse. Let's go to their fourth and fifth, where they talk about housing density and different kinds of buildings. Both of these literally make no sense. We would say that if they're building houses for rich individuals in market rate housing, that is not going to benefit poor people. I don't care if they are young poor people or old poor people, they will not build houses for poor people. So at that point, none of these matter. I don't care whether it's multi-family or it has a spa too, they are not going to the poor. No market rate housing goes to the poor. Let's go to their last warrant here, where they say the poor can't access it. But they say that people only rent out to rich individuals with rent control. But we tell you, affordable housing basically forces these companies to build housing units for poor individuals. And at the point where that has lifted 4 million people out of poverty, we still say that is a very good way to go. So, at the end of this round, there's a few things to remember. First, their entire case is contingent on the third warrant. If they do not win, that this exodus happens and that the wealthy are going to leave and the poor will take their places, and that is a good thing, they do not win. Because even if they build different types of buildings, at the point where 95% are going to rich individuals, they have no offense in this round. Second, at the end of this round, just because they prove that supply increases, that does not mean that poor people have access to it. If we win our second contention, we also control the internal link to this entire round. Because the price gets too much, millions of people are pushed out. So, whichever way you decide to vote in this round, you probably have to vote for us regardless, because we win the internal link to helping the most amount of poor people. They're only helping the rich, and that's why we think you should negate.
I see 95%. Everybody ready? I'm going to start on my case, responding to some of the responses they made in Cindy's rebuttal. At the top of my opponent's case, rebuttal, they tell you that we don't provide affordable homes. But remember the evidence at the bottom of our case they never interact with. What Diamond tells you is that you see 15% larger supply of homes in a world without rent control, and Kiang tells you that that directly leads to a 5% reduction in rents when you have that larger supply. At that point, you decrease rents on net, these houses become more affordable, including the ones we have now. Then they try and tell you that 95% of houses become luxury houses. Recognize that that is before the end of rent control, which is why it is not applicable. Instead, you can extend auteur from our fifth torn. What a torn tells you is that because of rent control, people who would have otherwise built middle or low income housing think it's going to be less profitable, which is why they build other types of structures like commercial buildings. In a world without rent control, they start to come back, which has two implications. One, we directly lead to the type of housing that's really important for people to get because you bring developers back. But two, the only reason why the luxury housing they talk about is so prevalent right now is because of rent control. But even if you want to vote off of this idea of luxury housing, you're still voting for us because they never interact with the Strauss evidence, which takes into account the fact that luxury housing is really expensive and finds that because it shifts people up who don't have housing right now, there's a shortage of luxury housing, you still see that there's a decrease in displacement at every single income level. That's why Diamond tells you that the people living in affordable housing units will become 18% lower income in a world without rent control. On to their case. First, they talk to you about demolition. Recognize that one, this demolition is only cost effective in certain neighborhoods. They don't tell you it actually exists across the country. Two, just because we have demolition doesn't mean that people get displaced. They don't access their impact because it is illegal to displace people through demolishing their building without providing them with an alternative. You either need to move them into an apartment with lower rent or move them into a more expensive apartment, but pay for it for 6 years. Their impact is literally not true. But third, recognize that insofar as our entire case is reasons why affordable housing is worse than market rate housing, I would argue that demolishing the same number of units to get better housing that leads to lower rents on average across the city because developers make a little bit more and can spread the wealth around is really, really good thing. But then finally, recognize that there are reasons why you see more housing uniquely in our world. For example, the fact that you bring new developers back, developers have more profit, or that you lower density regulations because those density regulations uniquely cause people to build less dense housing to evade affordable housing laws. At that point, you're going to see more housing in a world without rent control. On their impact about displacement. Recognize that one, the Miller evidence takes this out completely because he tells you that eviction gets really high in a world with rent control because people want to get rid of tenants they think won't pay, which is why they kick out poor people from affordable housing. That means that you still see impoverished persons not able to live in these buildings. That's really important. You weigh this on scope because a world where you're building more housing benefits everyone to a degree that a couple of demolition units, while they may be bad, do not affect the entire city. But then on their second convention about rent burdens, they talk about this idea of gentrification. Rich people moving in, luxury housing getting really high and not being bad. First off, you can cross-apply the responses I made on my case about luxury housing going down as a proportion of construction when you have no rent controls. But then second off, recognize that you also, it doesn't matter insofar as rent across the city is going down. They don't actually prove to you that rent goes up on net only in specific localized areas. I would argue that on scope, you're still voting for us. But then recognize they never actually prove the link into their impact. They tell you that rent in general can be bad, but that's rent as a proportion to income, not just rent. And what Freeman is really explicit about telling you is that when you look at the trajectory of displacement in those cities beforehand, because the richer people bring investment with them and bring businesses that employ people with them, you see no displacement in cities that are gentrifying after examining 60 years of data. Instead, he examines the actual impact and finds that that investment in those jobs, according to Hartley, lead to a 23% reduction in poverty without kicking anyone out. At that point, here's how you weigh this. It is true that sometimes building market rate housing can be bad. Sometimes you do have to demolish buildings. Sometimes you do lead to wealthier neighborhoods. But on scope, those impacts are far outweighed by the idea that you can build more housing, you can drive down rents across cities, and you can lead to better investment leading into impoverished neighborhoods that really, really need the help. That is why you are voting AF today.
Alright, so you say that it's all about like before rent control. When there's no rent control, they build more housing for poor people, right? Yeah. So if I'm a developer, what is my incentive to build a house for low to moderate income individual?
It makes you money.
But does it not make me more money to build housing for really rich people?
No, wait. So affordable housing, for example, is a lot cheaper to produce. You can build an apartment building with lots of affordable housing units, but you have to build less luxury housing units. units, or
Wait.
it costs more money to build luxury housing
on
units,
net,
right?
right? It's still much more lucrative for builders to build for rich individuals. That's why
No,
they're
that's-
doing it all across the board.
There's a market for building housing for middle and low income people
if-
that make up the majority of
if
this
your
country.
ar-
It's
yeah.
not like every developer can build penthouses all the
Yeah,
time.
if your argument was true, then we would not have to need subsidies to get builders to build affordable housing.
We
would
don't
not
need
government
subsidies to get,
regulation to make
wait.
them do that.
We
do.
don't need subsidies to get people
Then
to
why
build
do we
low-income
have them?
housing, except for the fact that there is rent control right now on affordable housing that disincentivizes developers
So
from building
your
it. In a
argument-
world without rent control, according to Autor, you would see more developers coming back from the commercial
Because-
sectors in order to build the
because-
exact type of housing
No,
we
no,
need.
no, wait,
Can I ask you a
why-
question now?
Really quickly, why would they go from commercials, like areas which are making them a ton of money?
Because
to
there
this
is a huge
affordable
market-
housing, which doesn't make you as much money.
Because it's not like just because it's a bigger building doesn't mean it always makes you more money. There's a huge market
There's
for
also a
middle and
huge
low
market
income
for
housing. They can
commercial
build.
building. There's even a
They're
bigger market
different
for that.
markets. It's like saying
And
just
one is
because
more
Nike
lucrative.
shoes are more expensive than like some random knockoff shoes, nobody's ever going to make the knockoff shoes. Right? Like
Building
you can
a
make
mall-
money either
building
way.
a mall is going to get you a lot more money than building an affordable
We can only
housing
have
unit.
so many malls. Like I can't shop all the
There's
time.
like-
So, that's true.
Yeah.
So the question though, talking about luxury housing, you told me that it takes a long time to trickle down, right?
Yes.
So that's talking about the amount of time it takes for an impoverished person or someone who needs low-income housing to end up in that house, right?
Or like the benefits, I guess, of market rate housing to get.
Not really. So it's actually not talking about the benefits. I agree that if I have a really expensive house, it's not going to end up in the hands of someone who needs affordable housing right away. But what Strauss tells you is that it lets someone who might be about to move into that income bracket or is in that income bracket but
Yeah.
doesn't have a house they want right now to move
Look,
into that,
yeah,
and then someone beneath them
and-
moves up, and someone
we-
beneath them moves
we
up,
under-
and that's why you
we'll-
reduce
yeah, all right.
displacement in every income bracket when you build luxury housing.
Okay.
It's great.
So, yeah. So that was great for you to just repeat your case, but the problem with
Well,
that.
it was a
is
response to a response you made that doesn't apply. I'm not talking about poor people getting these houses.
We agree with your idea here that it might be really good to get this trickle down started.
It is.
But it's not going to happen for 10 years, 20 years
No.
to get these people to, like, it's not like if you
Wait,
moved out of
people-
Newton, like, maybe I would go there and then Danny would go there and then, like,
People are
immediately
moving,
someone in poverty would
wait,
go there.
We're having a housing shortage. People move houses all the time. People always want houses.
But
That's why
poor
Diamond
people
finds
want houses, not like random
yeah, and you
upper
make
middle
space
class
for them.
people.
That's why Diamond finds that without rent control, the income of the people living in those houses gets 18% lower.
Okay. So everybody ready? First, let's look at their case when they tell you let's go to let's go to their arguments. That's right. So their first argument here is that people right now are buying, or like in the commercial market, and when you get rid of it and we don't vote for them, they're going to come back to the housing market, and that's going to be really good. The problem with this argument is that it's more profit in the status quo to look to build luxury homes than it is to build affordable housing. That's why in the status quo, in places that do have market rate housing, like in Portland, Oregon, 95% of housing was built to be like luxury homes and like penthouses. This is really important in the round for a few reasons. First of all, it means that even if they come back to the housing market, they're not doing it to help the people that actually matter, which are the poor people. And second of all, that brings me to their other argument, which is the Strauss analysis, which tells you that like basically through Reaganomics, there's going to be a trickle down of housing, and eventually the poor people will move into like a house that's a little better. First of all, the argument here is very simple. It takes way too long for this to actually materialize into anything that we can put our finger on. For example, the only example that I could give in First Crossfire, and Amit couldn't give any example, is that happened in the baby boomer generation in the 50s. That took 65 years for us to see any impacts of it. There's no actual thing to put your finger on here. The argument here is really simple. Even if they build some houses, even if the middle class can move up, they need to prove that they're actually helping the lowest income bracket, because that's what we're doing right now in the status quo. You know that 4 million people are being saved by affordable housing. You put that at risk in their world for a chance that you see an impact decades in the future, according to the Chu analysis. The time frame analysis is why you're going to vote for us, because millions of people are in poverty, millions of people are displaced right now. Their advocacy is that do this policy, and then maybe 30 years down the line you'll see some benefit. At that point, let's look to where we win in 100% probability, which is our second contention. They give one main response here is that when rent goes down, they're the gentrification is good because there's going to be more investment from rich people. But the investment that isn't actually seen by the poor people, because the poor people, because rent is so high, are pushed to the peripheries of cities. They can no longer afford to live in the cities, so even if investment is spurring business, they're already out there and pushed to the peripheries of cities because rent is too high. That's when the warrant evidence tells you that even if they're not displaced, there's a 44% increase in material hardship because they're paying too much for rent, they can't buy food, they can't buy healthcare. Please vote for the
Yeah, that's right.
Let's see 44%.
what?
44%.
Okay. Everybody all set? On luxury housing, 3 responses. The first is the Trouse analysis. It tells you that it's not necessarily a shift from having $1 million house go to the poorer classes. Rather, it's going to see a gradual decrease. That's why Danny and Sandeep's example about the white picket fence doesn't materialize here, because what Jay and I have been telling you that the whole round is is that you will see an increase by income bracket, meaning that the upper class people, the top 1% buy houses, which the income bracket right below them matriculates to them, and then so forth and so forth. That's why the diamond analysis that Danny Cold Job in his summary tells you that when you affirm the resolution, you're going to be seeing that people in affordable housing are 18% poorer because they're the ones that are actually able to get houses now, as opposed to completely broke. But more importantly, they will tell you that you're only exclusively they're going to tell you that luxury housing is really bad. Even if you don't buy my responses about trickling down, realize the only reason people are building luxury housing specifically is because rent controls exist, meaning the incentive to build affordable housing doesn't exist insofar as you have a cap on how much you can charge, meaning that at the end of the day, this doesn't matter. But what you do look for is the auto evidence, which we tell you from our 5th link very clearly tells you that when you affirm the resolution, you no longer see people just focusing on making as much money because they see rent controls exist. In the negative world, they don't they only build commercial housing. So I see a 6 percentage point decrease in affordable housing in my opponent's world when you vote for them. 2 implications. The first is you see a direct increase in affordable housing, meaning we access Danny's time frame analysis far better than he does because you see a 6% increase automatically when you vote for us. But the second is you decrease the prevalence of luxury housing and increase the prevalence of affordable housing, meaning we win on both the short and the long term. But let's talk about the only way Danny and Sandeep can win this round. On their second tension about gentrification, their whole argument is that you just you see poor people pushed to the outskirts of towns as opposed to the insides. 2 responses. 1, this is kind of foolish. It takes years for gentrification to materialize. It's not like suddenly in 1 year everyone is pushed out. But second off, realize that insofar as the Hartley evidence tells you poverty is decreasing by 23% because income is rising for people accounted for all the displacement, you're going to be seeing that people aren't necessarily pushed to the outskirts. Rather, you're going to be seeing that because their incomes are rising, that doesn't mean they're more rent burden, meaning they don't access their impacts at the end of the day. You guys ready for your grand cross?
Okay, so why is there a 6% increase in affordable housing in the outlook?
Developers want to make money, I agree. But the way they make money is by looking for markets where they say there's high demand here and I can make some degree of profit, right? Like the profit margin times the amount of demand, essentially. Right?
Yeah.
In a world where you have rent controls, the profit margin goes way down, which is why they look for other sources of income, commercial housing or commercial development, luxury housing, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But
So
in
they
a
come back.
what?
So they come back into the housing market.
Sure.
Why do they look to affordable housing instead of things that are more profitable?
Because there's high demand there.
Demand for it, and
There's
there's
high
no
demand,
rent.
there's high
But there's,
demand for rich
That's,
stuff.
I mean,
there's
guys,
no
like,
rent control
there,
on it.
I
You can
agree,
publish
I
something
agree
for
that
it.
some developers are still going to decide that commercial real estate and luxury housing is more profitable.
Well, 95%
But
of them.
No, 95%
that's what's
in
happening
the
right
status quo, when you have rent control.
We're saying
But-
95% of
without
developers
rent
who are
control.
already in the housing market.
Sure.
So following
Some
the
of
That's
it's
calculus.
exclusively
back.
because you have
Wait,
rent
wait,
controls
guys,
in the market,
guys,
meaning
you're-
that they don't go for affordable
Is,
housing.
is your
My
argument
question is-
seriously that there's an entire field, right, of people who are real estate developers or something, and all of them are going to do the same
No,
type because
we
there's
don't-
one type that's
Like,
the most
we're
profitable?
not saying that it's not all or nothing, we're just saying disproportionately.
Well, why don't they all build
rich houses.
castles?
Not castles. you know.
But like those seem really profitable. Why don't all
Nice
developers
hotels,
build castles?
malls.
But there's a
They build
limited
them
demand
modern
for that, and there's
equivalents
demand
of
for other
Like,
stuff
they
too.
could-
When you raise the amount of money you can get, you get
Again,
more developers to come back.
We're not,
There's a nice
we're not
equilibrium
saying
there.
that everyone builds castles. We're saying that on net, it's mostly going to upper class individuals, and that makes sense, because that's
So-
where the most money is.
That doesn't make
No.
sense, because when you don't have rent controls anymore, you see there's far more profit in these.
So
houses.
if-
Otherwise,
so
guys,
here's
people
what-
build
here's my
apartment
question.
buildings
Why
all the
people don't
time.
afford affordable
But the
housing.
People
problem
build
with that.
apartment buildings all the time.
People
Yeah.
build castles all the time.
Sure, I agree. There's a whole spectrum of the market where
but
people
I-
build in
I-
every area because they can make money
I
there.
think-
I'm gonna ask you a question after we've been talking about this for a while. So your point about gentrification, right? Your impact evidence, which is the only offense you have in today's round, by the way. This thing about right, this thing about 44%. It's talking about like high rent cities versus low rent cities, right? Expensive cities versus not
It's,
expensive
it's,
cities.
one part's about families being rent burdened, and then the next part's about living in a high cost city.
Cool. The reason there's a difference between high cost
You're
cities
trying to, like,
and
respond
low
to
cost
this
cities.
and Brand cross because he forgot to like some.
No, he did.
Did he respond?
I did
Yeah,
respond
he
to
said
it,
that
and
there's
then-
more.
said?
No, he said there's.
Like part of it.
He said there's more income coming in, right?
Okay,
Hence, you see
yeah,
no
the
displacement and
problem
decrease in
with
poverty.
your
But wait,
poverty
your
problem-
analysis
no, no, no,
is
no, no.
contingent
No,
on them
that's-
being
no.
more rent burdened than before. If they're not more rent burdened
Yeah,
because they're
so
getting more
the-
income too,
the
you don't get an
problem
income.
with your poverty evidence is like the way they get those calculations. They look at what was the poverty rate before we started having
That's not
gentrification.
true. They
What's
also
after.
No, they
and
account-
like
For
that's
what?
not true.
How
You
can
look
they-
at
how
census
can
data,
they-
look
they-
at census data and look
they're-
at the families that are there.
they're looking for
Yeah, how families
deviations.
are different because
Right,
rich
but-
people
No,
move in and poor people.
guys,
get
you
kicked
dropped
out.
the
No, you
Freeman
hardly
evidence
have
complete. You
very
dropped the
clearly
Freeman
covered.
evidence. You dropped the Freeman evidence completely to analyze 6 years of data, and
You
there's
can't-
no displacement
you
whatsoever
can't
when you
connect the
account
two
for how many
because
people were
you
moving
can't
in or out
connect the
beforehand.
Okay, is everyone ready? Let's start on their case. This is what Amit says in his summary. The first thing he says, it's a gradual process of trickle down. Like, we agree with their idea. We tell you that that gradual process takes too long. The evidence that they've never responded to tells you that it takes decades for this to happen. They just try to hide behind this piece of evidence that's an 18% decrease in income. We both have evidence saying what happens with gentrification and rent control. Look to the warranting, right? They never respond to the idea that it takes decades for this to happen. So even if you believe this argument, it is simply too long to wait, and our side of the case comes first. But second, they say that rent control means that they're going to build better buildings. But we tell you, as we've established in literally every crossfire, they're still going to disproportionately benefit rich individuals and upper class individuals. No one is just going to stop building really big malls for rich people and just suddenly go and start building affordable housing, or else we really wouldn't need subsidies for affordable housing. This argument does not make sense. And again, Jay's gonna try and paint us like we're saying it's all or nothing. No, disproportionately, they are going to try and help rich areas when you vote for the affirmative. That means they have no offense in this round. Lastly, they say that there's a 6% decrease in affordable housing in our world. That's not true. If you look to the real world, 4 million people have been lifted out of poverty as a result of affordable housing. You know 100% that that continues if you vote for them. You don't know if it does when you vote for when you vote for us, it's good, not for them. Let's go back to our case. So, Amit says two things in his summary. Don't let Jay bring up a third. The first thing he says is that, oh, gentrification doesn't happen immediately. It takes years. This is not true. In the first year after construction, property values rise, people are kicked out. That's what happens when you build sports stadiums and things like that. That's why we tell you that there's an increase in homelessness. They say there's a 20% decrease in poverty. We tell you that that study is basically saying what happens before and after all the poor people are no longer living in the city, so they go somewhere else. They're going to say that there's no increase in displacement. That evidence is only about New York. We also have conflicting evidence about displacement. How do you settle the debate? We tell you that even if people stay, they face 44% increase in material hardships, which means that even if they are staying, they can no longer afford food and medicine, and those are two prerequisites. So at the end of the day, AF only benefits the rich, we benefit the poor, so do what's right.
Everybody ready? We're going to start on their offense, their only offense about gentrification. Remember the Freeman evidence who tells you that after analyzing 60 years of data, gentrification does not lead to displacement. There's a reason for this, because when you have richer people moving in, you also have companies targeted towards them that employ people, and you have more investment moving into the neighborhood, which is why in these poverty traps, where nobody was going to be able to escape, no investment was coming in, you now have a chance, which is why two things happen. One, you don't give them their impact, because their impact is predicated on the rent burden going up, on people not making more money as their rent increases, but they haven't proven that to you in today's round. They get no offense. But second off, you actually vote for us, because the Hartley evidence tells you that when there is no displacement, you see a 23% decrease in poverty. People are getting lifted out of poverty. If you want to help the poor, this is the most direct way to do it. But let's talk about supply anyway. First off, on luxury housing, the trust analysis is really clear. We don't have to prove to you that poor people move into these white picket fence houses. That's what they're trying to tell you takes a lot of time. We're telling you that when you make space at the top of the market shifts so that people can move up, which is why Diamond tells you that you see an 18% decrease in income in the people living at the bottom of the market. That doesn't take much time. People move around all the time. It's a thing that the market does to fix itself. You give houses to the people who need it, where right now they're being pushed out. But second, on this point about supply, what Ator tells you is that because of rent controls, people aren't building the types of houses that are really necessary, low-income houses. They try and tell you that people are never going to want to do that. But I would ask you, why do like clothes producers ever produce non-designer clothing then? There's high demand for low-income housing. That's why people are going to build it when they think they can make a profit. And Ator quantifies that you're going to see a 6 percentage point increase in rental affordable housing. And Kiang does the net analysis for you at the end of the day and tells you see a 5% decrease in rent when you have no more rent control. I would argue that this outweighs their case on scope, because even if you do see some communities where gentrification happens and some people being pushed out of their homes, they tell you themselves that the rent burden is what leads to their 44% impact, rent getting higher. The best way to decrease the rent is to build more houses and solve the housing crisis once and for all. That is why you vote.